"Dad, without your signature, we lose the house." My son Andrew said those words across a polished closing table while his wife Sarah held his hand and waited for my answer. In front of me sat the documents that would consume a large part of the retirement savings I had spent nearly 40 years building. I signed anyway. I thought I was helping my only son build a future. I never imagined that 3 years later, inside that same property, I would learn exactly how little my sacrifice meant to the people living there. And when they finally decided I was no longer necessary, they would discover one detail they had conveniently forgotten. My signature hadn't made me a guarantor. It had made me an owner. Please, before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. My name is Peter Johnson. I was 67 when Andrew called to tell me he and Sarah had finally found the house they wanted. I had recently retired after decades of working overtime, driving old cars, skipping expensive vacations, and putting whatever I could into savings. My wife Helen had died from cancer several years earlier, and without her, retirement didn't feel like the peaceful chapter we had imagined. Andrew was our only son. Helping him build the stable life Helen and I had always wanted for him felt like one final responsibility we could still fulfill together. The house was a 3-bedroom colonial with a large backyard in a quiet neighborhood. Andrew loved it immediately. Sarah already had plans for the kitchen, the garden, and the rooms they hoped their future children would someday use. But their excitement disappeared when the bank reviewed the numbers. Their down payment wasn't enough, Andrew's credit wasn't strong enough, and they couldn't qualify for the financing on their own. Andrew sounded defeated when he called me. "Dad, I hate asking you this." I knew what was coming before he finished. I told him to send me the paperwork. A few days later, I transferred money from my retirement savings and joined them at the closing. I still remember the attorney stopping before the final signatures. He wanted to make certain I understood the arrangement. The bank wasn't accepting me merely as someone guaranteeing Andrew's loan. Because of the financing structure and my contribution, I would be a co-borrower, and my name would be recorded as an owner of the property. "Mr. Johnson, this gives you a legal interest in the house," he explained. I looked at Andrew. He looked nervous, almost embarrassed that his father had to rescue him at his age. I didn't want him feeling ashamed. "He's my son," I said. "That's all I need to understand." Then I signed. Andrew hugged me outside the attorney's office. "I'll never forget this, Dad." I believed him. That weekend, I helped them move into the house. I carried boxes, repaired a loose porch railing, painted one of the bedrooms, and stayed until almost midnight helping Andrew assemble furniture. Before I left, we stood together in the backyard looking at the lights glowing through the windows. Andrew quietly said, "Mom would have loved this." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I put my hand on his shoulder. "Make it a good home, son." That's what she would have wanted. I drove away that night feeling lighter than I had since Helen died. I didn't think about percentages, ownership rights, or how much money I had withdrawn from retirement. The deed could say Peter Johnson and Andrew Johnson, but in my mind, the house belonged to my son. I had given him the start. Helen and I had spent our lives trying to provide. For a while, Andrew seemed to remember that. He called regularly. He invited me over for dinner. He asked my advice whenever something needed repairing. But as the months became years, those calls became shorter and the invitations less frequent. Sarah's warmth disappeared first. Andrew's followed more quietly. I noticed it, but I kept finding excuses for them. They were married, they were busy, they needed their own life. I had spent decades believing that being a good father meant giving without keeping score, so I never reminded them whose savings made the house possible, or whose name remained beside Andrew's on the legal documents. I simply waited for my son to remember on his own. 3 years after the closing, Andrew finally called with an invitation that made me believe he had. They were holding a housewarming party the following Saturday, he told me, and he wanted me there early. Then he added something I hadn't expected. "Come at 3, Dad. We want to take the family photo before everyone arrives." I smiled after we hung up. After months of wondering whether I still had a place in Andrew's life, I finally had my answer. At least, I thought I did. For the first year after Andrew and Sarah moved into the house, I never questioned my place in their lives. Andrew called most Sundays, sometimes just to ask how I was doing, sometimes because a faucet leaked or the furnace made a strange noise. I liked being needed, although I tried not to show it. After Helen died, those small conversations gave structure to weeks that otherwise felt painfully empty. Sarah was courteous in those days. She thanked me when I repaired something, remembered my birthday, and occasionally sent leftovers home with me after dinner. Nothing felt wrong until the changes became too consistent to ignore. Sunday calls became twice a month, then once a month. Dinner invitations disappeared. When I called Andrew, he often sounded distracted and promised to call back, but rarely did. I told myself that was normal. A father isn't supposed to compete with his son's marriage for attention. But Sarah's behavior was harder to explain. Whenever I visited, there was a formality in the way she greeted me, as though I were a neighbor who had arrived without warning, rather than the man whose name was on the deed. If Andrew and I started talking about baseball, work, or an old family memory, Sarah suddenly needed his help somewhere else. Andrew, can you come into the kitchen? Andrew, remember what we need to do tonight. The conversation would end, and I would sit alone until I finally understood it was time to leave. I tried harder instead of confronting her. I brought Sarah flowers on her birthday. I remembered their anniversary. At Christmas, I gave them savings bonds, because I still believed helping them build security was one of the few useful things I could offer. The more I gave, however, the more uncomfortable Sarah seemed, with the reminder that they had once needed me. One evening, I overheard her telling a friend how proud she was that she and Andrew had built everything from nothing. I was standing 10 feet away. She knew I could hear her. I said nothing. Maybe that was my mistake. I had never considered my contribution a debt, so I didn't expect gratitude to be paid back forever. But there was a difference between not demanding gratitude and allowing someone to rewrite history. Andrew noticed the tension. I know he did, because whenever Sarah made a dismissive comment, he immediately changed the subject. He never joined her in insulting me, but he never stopped her either. That silence began hurting more than Sarah's coldness. He was my son. I had raised him to speak when something was wrong, yet inside his own home he had learned that avoiding conflict was easier than defending the person being pushed aside. Still, I kept making excuses for him. Marriage required compromise. Sarah was his wife. Perhaps he believed keeping peace with her was the responsible thing to do. I didn't want to become another problem he had to manage. So I stopped dropping by without an invitation. Then I stopped asking when we might have dinner. Eventually, weeks passed without seeing him at all. The strangest part was that I never regretted helping them buy the house. Whenever I drove through their neighborhood and saw that colonial at the end of the street, I remembered Andrew standing beside me after the closing, saying he would never forget what I had done. I kept believing that boy was still somewhere inside the man who now barely called. Then, on a Friday evening, my phone buzzed while I was eating leftover spaghetti alone at the kitchen table. Andrew. Seeing his name still made my heart lift. "Dad," he said when I answered, "we're having a housewarming party next Saturday. We've finally gotten everything the way we want it." I waited, afraid he was merely informing me about it. Then he said, "We'd really like you to come." For the first time in months, I smiled without forcing it. Maybe I had imagined the distance. Maybe this was Andrew's way of reaching back toward me. Then he told me to arrive an hour before the other guests because they wanted to take an official family photograph. After we hung up, I sat alone holding the phone and thinking about those two words, family photograph. I had spent 3 years slowly being pushed toward the edge of their lives. Now I believed my son was finally inviting me back into the picture. I didn't yet understand how literal that thought was about to become. I spent the next week preparing for that housewarming party as though it were something far more important than an afternoon gathering. Looking back, that probably sounds foolish, but when you've spent years wondering whether your only child still wants you in his life, a simple invitation can feel like a door opening again. Andrew had specifically asked me to arrive at 3, an hour before most of the guests, because they wanted to take the family photograph first. I held on to that detail. Family, not visitors, not friends. Family. On Monday, I drove into town and bought a new light blue shirt. Sarah had once mentioned that the color suited me, and although I hated admitting how much her approval still mattered, I wanted to make a good impression. Friday morning, I got a haircut. That evening, I polished the same dress shoes I had worn to Andrew and Sarah's wedding. I even practiced smiling in the bathroom mirror before laughing at myself. Helen would have teased me mercilessly. "Peter, you're visiting your son, not meeting the president." Thinking of her made the room feel less empty for a moment. I wanted to bring something meaningful. So instead of buying another bottle of wine or some expensive decoration Sarah might never use, I commissioned a local craftsman to make a wooden welcome sign for their front entrance. Across the center were the words, "The Johnson Family." When I picked it up, I ran my fingers over the carved letters and imagined Andrew hanging it beside the door. Maybe someday grandchildren would run underneath it. Maybe years from now, he would remember that his father had given it to him during the first celebration in the home we had bought together. Saturday morning arrived with a text from Andrew. "See you at 3, Dad. Most people are coming at 4. Family picture first." I read it twice. Whatever doubts I had carried during the previous months began to loosen. Maybe Sarah's distance had nothing to do with me. Maybe Andrew had simply been overwhelmed by work and marriage. I had spent too much time alone since Helen died, and loneliness has a way of turning small disappointments into evidence of something larger. At least, that was what I wanted to believe. I placed the wooden sign carefully on the passenger seat and left home early. The 40-minute drive took me through winding suburban roads, lined with autumn trees. Orange and red leaves moved in the wind, and for once I wasn't thinking about mortgages, retirement accounts, or how rarely Andrew called. I was thinking about the photograph. I imagined standing beside my son with one hand on his shoulder. I wondered whether Andrew might ask for a copy for me to keep at home. As I approached their neighborhood, however, my confidence began slipping. My palms became damp against the steering wheel. I hadn't seen many of Sarah's relatives since the wedding, and I knew some of them came from a world very different from mine. Wealthier, better dressed, more polished. I reminded myself that none of that mattered. Andrew was my son. I belonged there. When I turned onto their street, I immediately saw balloons tied to the mailbox. Cars already lined both sides of the road, even though it wasn't yet 4. The lawn had been perfectly trimmed. Catering equipment stood near the side gate, and through the windows I could see people moving around with glasses in their hands. This wasn't the small gathering I had imagined. It looked like an event designed to impress everyone who walked through the door. I parked several houses away, checked my shirt in the mirror, then picked up the wooden sign. "Don't make this complicated, Peter," I whispered to myself. "Go celebrate your son." The closer I walked, the more clearly I could hear laughter coming from inside. For a moment, I stopped at the bottom of the front steps and looked up at the house. 3 years earlier, I had stood in that backyard with Andrew while we talked about Helen and everything this home represented. I smiled at the memory and climbed the steps. My hand was almost on the front door when a woman's voice stopped me from behind. "Peter?" I turned. Sarah stood several feet away in a cream-colored dress and pearls, staring first at me and then at the welcome sign in my hands. There was no warmth in her expression. She walked toward me, lowered her voice, and said, "The front door is for the guests. I need you to go around back." "The front door is for guests, Peter. Go around back." Sarah said it with such casual certainty that for a moment I wondered whether I had heard her correctly. Behind her, people were already walking through the house carrying glasses of champagne, but I swallowed the embarrassment. "Andrew asked me to come early for the family picture." "I know," she replied. "Everyone's in the backyard." She stepped between me and the doorway, leaving no doubt that the conversation was over. I tightened my grip on the wooden welcome sign and walked around the side of the house. The backyard looked more like an expensive reception than a housewarming. Near the gazebo stood Sarah's mother, Margaret, greeting guests as though she were the hostess. Andrew was beside her. When he saw me, he gave me a nervous smile. "Dad, you made it." I handed him the sign. "Thought you might hang this near the front door." He barely looked at it before setting it beside the bar. "Thanks. We're about to take the pictures." I waited for a hug or even a handshake. Neither came. Minutes later, the photographer called everyone toward the gazebo. "Immediate family first, please." I stepped forward. Sarah immediately took Margaret by the arm. "Mom," right beside Andrew. She positioned her mother in the center, stood on Andrew's other side, then called her sister over. I remained several feet away, waiting. The photographer looked around. Anyone else for immediate family? My eyes went directly to Andrew. He saw me. I know he did. But before he could speak, Sarah answered, "No, that's the core group." The words landed harder than I expected. "Andrew told me we were taking a family photo," I said. Sarah gave a small laugh. "We are, Peter. We just want the formal one first. Too many people will make it look crowded." Then she placed a hand on my arm and guided me toward an oak tree near the fence. "Wait over here." I stopped beneath the branches, but Sarah moved me farther. A little more. 2 more steps put the trunk directly between me and the camera. I stared at her. "You want me behind the tree?" "Only for a few minutes," she said softly. "Please don't make this awkward." I almost laughed at the cruelty of that sentence. I was the one being hidden, yet somehow I was being warned not to embarrass them. I looked past Sarah toward my son. Andrew stood beside Margaret adjusting his jacket. Our eyes met. That was his chance. He didn't need to argue with his wife. He didn't need to ruin the party. All he had to say was, "Dad belongs in the picture." Instead, he looked away. So I stepped behind the tree. The photographer raised his camera. Everybody closer together. Through a gap in the branches, I watched Margaret place one hand on Andrew's shoulder while Sarah leaned against him. Click. They smiled. Click. They laughed. Click. It was the perfect portrait of a family that apparently no longer included the man who had helped put a roof over their heads. I thought about the closing table 3 years earlier. Andrew squeezing my shoulder and promising, "I'll never forget this, Dad." Standing behind that tree, I finally understood how easily people forget sacrifices once they become comfortable living inside them. The worst part wasn't Sarah. I had never raised Sarah. I hadn't spent sleepless nights beside her crib or taught her to ride a bicycle. Andrew was the reason my chest hurt. Once during the photographs, he glanced toward me again. For half a second, I thought he might finally stop everything and call me over. He didn't. He turned back toward the camera. That single movement changed something inside me. For years, I had told myself that being a good father meant never forcing my son to choose between his wife and me. But I wasn't asking him to choose. I was waiting for him to recognize when something was simply wrong. When the photographer finally lowered his camera, nobody came to tell me the few minutes were over. I stepped out from behind the tree on my own. The party continued as if nothing had happened. Margaret raised a champagne glass near the gazebo and proudly talked about everything Andrew and Sarah had accomplished. Sarah smiled beside her. Andrew remained silent. I turned away before anyone saw the tears gathering in my eyes and found a small bench near the garage where the fence blocked me from the crowd. I sat down and stared at my polished shoes, suddenly ashamed that I had spent an entire week trying so hard to look worthy of people who had just hidden me from their family photograph. Then voices drifted from the other side of the fence. Sarah spoke first. "I don't know why you even invited him, Andrew." I froze. Then Margaret began to answer, and I stayed perfectly still. Something in her voice told me I needed to hear every word that came next. I stayed perfectly still on the bench as Sarah's voice carried through the fence. "I don't know why you even invited him, Andrew. He makes everything uncomfortable." For a moment there was silence. Then Andrew answered quietly. "He's my father, Sarah." I waited for more. I wanted him to say that I belonged there, that hiding me behind a tree had crossed a line. Instead, Sarah gave a short laugh. "Your father doesn't know when to let go. He walks around this place like we still owe him something," Margaret joined in. "She's right, Andrew. You're married now. This is your home and your life. Peter needs to understand that." My hands slowly tightened together. I had never asked them to repay me. I had never demanded recognition for the money I contributed, or reminded them that my name was on the title. Yet somehow my silence had been rewritten as interference. Sarah continued, "Today was supposed to show everyone what we've built. Then he arrives with that ridiculous sign like he needs people to remember he's connected to the house. The wooden sign. The gift I had spent days choosing was now another reason to resent me." Andrew murmured something I couldn't hear. Margaret answered sharply, "Stop feeling guilty. Your father helped you years ago. Parents help their children. That's what they're supposed to do. Sarah immediately agreed. Exactly. He acts like giving us the down payment made this some lifelong investment. It didn't. It was his duty. Something inside me went cold. Nearly 40 years of saving. Overtime shifts. Vacations Helen and I never took. Money I had protected for retirement after watching my wife die. To Sarah, all of that had become a duty she was entitled to receive. Then Andrew finally said, "He did more than just help with the down payment." My heart lifted slightly. At least he remembered. But Sarah's answer came immediately. "And we've thanked him. How many years are we supposed to keep doing it?" Margaret lowered her voice, but I could still hear every word. "The real issue is the title." My breathing stopped. Sarah said, "I know." Margaret continued, "As long as Peter's name is attached to the property, you're never completely independent. You need to refinance." Andrew sounded uncomfortable. "It's not that simple." "Of course it is," Sarah said. "We refinance under our names, Peter signs whatever is necessary, and then this finally becomes our house." "What if he doesn't sign?" Andrew asked. Sarah paused before answering. "Why wouldn't he?" "He thinks everything he does is for you. Tell him removing his name helps your credit, or simplifies the estate someday. He'll do it." I stared at the ground. They weren't discussing whether to ask me. They were discussing which explanation would make me cooperate. Margaret added, "Once he's off the deed, there won't be any reason for him to keep acting like he has a say here." Andrew sighed. "I don't want to hurt him." Sarah's voice hardened. "Then stop letting him make you feel guilty. His name being there is a technicality. This is our house. A technicality." That word finally stripped away the last excuse I had made for them. My name wasn't on those documents by accident. The bank required my income history, my credit, my money, and my legal responsibility because Andrew and Sarah couldn't qualify alone. I had signed as a co-borrower and owner. They had enjoyed the benefit of that arrangement for 3 years, and now they wanted the benefit without the man who made it possible. But the deepest wound still came from Andrew. He knew the truth. He knew exactly what I had sacrificed. And while his wife and mother-in-law planned how to manipulate me into surrendering my ownership, he offered nothing stronger than discomfort. No refusal, no defense, just silence. I sat there until their footsteps faded back toward the party. The sadness I had felt behind the tree was disappearing. In its place came something calmer and far more useful: clarity. I no longer needed Sarah to like me. I no longer needed Margaret to respect me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to protect Andrew from the consequences of refusing to protect me. I wiped my face, straightened the blue shirt I had bought for their photograph, and stood. They wanted me erased from the house? Fine. First, they were going to learn exactly what my name on that deed meant. I started toward the front of the property, intending to leave without another word. But as I reached the porch, I heard a guest speaking near the doorway. "Wait a minute," the man said. "Isn't Peter Johnson's name on this house too?" I stopped. I recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to Mark, the man who had been present when we signed the original closing documents. And judging by Sarah's suddenly pale expression across the yard, she recognized him too. Mark Reynolds stood near the patio with a drink in one hand, looking genuinely confused. "Isn't Peter Johnson's name on this house too?" The conversation around him softened almost immediately. Sarah's face changed. A few seconds earlier, she had been laughing with her guests. Now her smile looked frozen. "Mark," she said quickly, "that's complicated." He shook his head. "Not really." I was at the closing. Several people turned toward him. I remained near the porch, saying nothing. Mark hadn't noticed me yet. "Peter wasn't just helping with paperwork," he continued. "If I remember correctly, he provided most of the money they needed up front and signed as a co-borrower." Margaret stepped closer. "I'm sure that was only temporary." Mark frowned. "Temporary or not," his name went on the title. "That's ownership." The word landed across the patio like a dropped glass. Sarah glanced toward Andrew, silently asking him to stop the conversation. Andrew didn't move. One of the guests asked, "So Peter actually owns part of the house?" Mark nodded. "Unless something changed since closing, yes." Whispers spread through the group. I watched Sarah's carefully constructed story begin cracking in less than 30 seconds. For 3 years, she had apparently allowed people to believe that she and Andrew had bought the house through their own success. Now the man who had handled the transaction was standing among those same people, explaining that they couldn't have purchased it without me. Sarah forced a laugh. Peter helped us because he's Andrew's father. Families do that. Mark looked uncomfortable. Sure, but that's different from saying you bought it yourselves. Margaret's expression hardened. Nobody said that. A woman near her quietly replied. You did, actually, about 10 minutes ago. Silence followed. Sarah's eyes finally found me. For the first time that afternoon, there was no contempt in them. There was fear. Peter, she called, suddenly using a warmer voice. Why are you standing over there? Come join us. The change was almost insulting. 20 minutes earlier, I had been too inconvenient to appear in their family photograph. Now that people knew my name was on the property, I was welcome in the center of the conversation. I walked toward them slowly. Mark noticed me and smiled. Peter, good to see you. I was just telling everyone about the closing. I heard, I said. Andrew stepped forward. Dad, maybe we should talk privately. I looked at him. About what? He lowered his voice. This doesn't need to become a scene. I almost smiled. Somehow the problem wasn't that his wife had hidden me behind a tree, or that I had just overheard them planning to remove me from the property. The problem was that their guests might discover the truth. Sarah moved beside him. Nobody is denying that you helped us. Helped? Mark repeated before I could answer. Peter, didn't you put up a substantial part of the down payment? I nodded once. Yes. And you're still on the mortgage? Yes. And the deed? Sarah interrupted. Mark, that's enough. He looked startled. I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. Then stop discussing our finances. Mark raised both hands and stepped back. But the damage was done. Guests who had barely acknowledged me earlier were now looking at me differently. I didn't enjoy it. Their sudden respect felt almost as uncomfortable as Sarah's earlier dismissal. I hadn't come to prove I was important. I had come because my son told me I belonged in a family photograph. Andrew rubbed his forehead. Dad, please. Let's handle this later. I studied him for a moment. Later? He nodded quickly. When everyone leaves. Behind him, Sarah looked relieved. She still believed silence would save her. Then Margaret made the mistake that changed my decision. Peter, surely you don't intend to make Andrew feel guilty over money you voluntarily gave him. Whatever paperwork exists, this is their home. I looked at her, then at Sarah, and finally at my son. An hour earlier I would have swallowed those words to keep the peace. But I had already heard what they planned to do once the guests were gone. They didn't want peace. They wanted my signature. I reached inside my jacket and touched the folded copy of the property record I had begun carrying after receiving the first refinancing notice weeks earlier. Andrew saw the movement, and his expression changed. Dad. I pulled the document halfway from my pocket, then stopped. You're right about one thing, I said quietly. We should clear this up. The patio went completely silent. Sarah stared at the paper in my hand. She had spent the afternoon trying to keep me out of the family picture. Now she was about to learn that removing me from a photograph was much easier than removing me from a deed. I pulled the document completely from my jacket and unfolded it in front of everyone. Since we're talking about whose home this is, perhaps we should stop relying on memories. Sarah stared at the paper. Andrew lowered his head. Mark already knew what it contained. I held it where the people nearest me could see the official property record and pointed to the names printed beneath the address. Peter Johnson, Andrew Johnson, 2 owners. Nobody spoke. I looked toward Margaret. You called my name on this house a technicality. It isn't. Then I turned to Sarah. And you said parents are supposed to help their children. You're right. That's why I used money. Helen and I spent almost 40 years saving to make this purchase possible. I never asked Andrew to repay me. I never demanded recognition. I didn't even correct people when they assumed the 2 of you bought this place alone. Sarah crossed her arms. Then why are you doing this now? I looked toward the oak tree near the fence. Several guests followed my eyes. Because today I was invited here for a family photograph, then told to stand behind that tree so I wouldn't appear in it. A murmur moved through the crowd. Sarah's face reddened. That's not what happened. It is exactly what happened. I kept my voice calm. But the photograph isn't why I'm holding this deed. While I was sitting alone afterward, I heard you discussing refinancing this property and removing my name from it. Andrew looked up sharply. Sarah froze. Margaret stepped forward. That was a private conversation. About my property, I replied. She had no answer. I turned toward Andrew. Did you know they planned to ask me to sign away my ownership? His silence answered before his mouth did. Dad, we were only discussing options. Were you going to tell me the truth about those options? He looked toward Sarah, then back at me. I don't know. That hurt, but it also gave me the clarity I needed. 3 years ago, you sat beside me at closing because you couldn't qualify for this house without my money and credit. I signed because you were my son. I trusted you enough that I never treated this place like an investment. I tapped the deed with one finger. But trust doesn't erase ownership. Sarah's voice became sharper. So what do you want, Peter? Gratitude? An apology? Do you want everyone here to thank you? No. I folded the document once. I want this arrangement ended. Andrew's face changed immediately. What does that mean? It means I'm no longer going to remain financially tied to a home where I'm treated like an inconvenience. Sarah stared at me. You can't just take our house. I'm not taking anything. I looked at Andrew. I'm giving you a choice. The entire patio became silent. Option 1. You and Sarah arrange financing and purchase my ownership interest at fair market value. Once payment is complete, I sign away my share and this becomes entirely yours. Andrew swallowed. And option 2, we sell the house. The mortgage is paid, the remaining proceeds are divided according to our legal interests, and everyone walks away. Sarah shook her head immediately. Absolutely not. We're not selling. I looked at her calmly. Then buy me out. We don't have that kind of money. Then you understand the problem. Her expression shifted from anger to panic. Margaret stepped closer. Peter, you're punishing them because your feelings were hurt. I shook my head. If this were about hurt feelings, I would have left after the photograph and said nothing. This is about discovering that people who benefited from my trust were already discussing how to remove me from something I legally own. Then I looked at Andrew. The hardest part isn't what Sarah said. It's that you stood beside her while she said it. His eyes filled, but I continued. When she put me behind that tree, I waited for you to speak. When they discussed removing my name, I waited again. I'm finished waiting. Andrew took a step toward me. Dad, please, give me time. You have time, I said. 30 days. Find financing and make me a legitimate buyout offer. If you can't, we'll discuss selling. I handed him a copy of the property record. Sarah looked at him as though expecting him to fight me. He simply stared at my name beside his. I picked up the wooden welcome sign from the table where Andrew had abandoned it earlier. For a moment I considered leaving it. Instead, I tucked it beneath my arm. I made the mistake of thinking this belonged here, I said quietly. Then I walked toward the gate. Nobody laughed. Nobody stopped me. And for the first time that afternoon, I didn't feel like the man hidden behind a tree. I felt like a man who had finally stopped asking permission to stand in his own life. I drove home from the party, with the wooden sign lying on the passenger seat beside me. 3 hours earlier, I had imagined Andrew hanging it proudly beside his front door. Now the words, "the Johnson family," felt almost cruel. By the time I reached home, my phone was already ringing. Andrew called 4 times that evening. Sarah called twice. I answered neither of them. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I simply knew that if I heard my son's voice while the humiliation was still fresh, I might surrender the same way I always had. The next morning, Andrew sent a message. Dad, I'm sorry. Please don't do anything yet. Let me fix this. I read it several times before putting the phone away. For most of my life, those words would have been enough. Andrew was my only child. Whenever he fell, I helped him stand. Whenever he made a mistake, I tried to soften the consequences. But somewhere along the way, protecting him had taught him that silence cost nothing. On Monday morning, I made an appointment with attorney Daniel Mercer, a property lawyer recommended by an old friend. I brought the deed, mortgage documents, closing records, and the refinancing notice I had received weeks earlier, but barely considered important at the time. Daniel spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing everything before removing his glasses. Peter, Your position is straightforward. You're a legal co-owner. Andrew and Sarah cannot simply erase your interest because they want the property in their names. What if I refuse to sign a refinance? I asked. Then they cannot voluntarily transfer your ownership without resolving your interest. If Andrew can't buy you out and the owners can't agree, there are legal procedures available to force a sale. Hearing it from an attorney made the situation feel different. Until that moment, part of me still thought of the house as Andrew's. Daniel saw the hesitation on my face. You don't have to decide today. I looked down at the deed. I've spent 3 years telling myself my name on this paper didn't matter because he's my son. Daniel waited. Yesterday, I learned it only didn't matter while it benefited them. He nodded slowly. Then decide based on what protects you now, not what protected them 3 years ago. That afternoon, I opened a separate account and instructed the bank that no changes involving the property were to be approved without my written authorization. Then I sent Andrew a short message. The 30-day deadline stands. Any buyout proposal must be in writing and based on fair market value. His reply arrived almost immediately. Dad, please don't turn this into a legal fight. I stared at those words for a long time. He still didn't understand. The legal fight had begun the moment they discussed removing me from the deed without honestly telling me why. I was simply refusing to lose it quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, Andrew sent apologies, promises, and explanations. He told me Sarah had been under pressure from Margaret. He admitted he should have defended me during the photograph. He said he had never intended to steal anything from me. I believed parts of what he said, but none of it changed the central truth. When choosing between confronting his wife and allowing his father to be humiliated, he had chosen silence repeatedly. On the 26th day, Andrew finally called and admitted the bank would not approve enough financing to purchase my share. Dad, he said, his voice breaking, if you force this, we'll lose the house. I closed my eyes. Andrew, you're not losing something that belonged only to you. That's the part you still haven't accepted. So, that's it? No. You still have 4 days. No offer arrived. On the morning after the deadline expired, I returned to Daniel's office. He placed the listing authorization and the first legal notices in front of me. My hand hovered over the signature line. For one painful second, I remembered Andrew standing in the backyard 3 years earlier telling me Helen would have loved the house. Then another memory replaced it. My son looking away while I stood behind a tree. I signed. Daniel gathered the documents and asked, "Are you sure?" I looked at my name on the deed one final time. For 3 years, I used that house to protect my son from consequences, I said. Now it's time he learns what consequences are. By that afternoon, the process of putting the property on the market had officially begun. The house went on the market the following week. I expected relief, but when the listing appeared online, all I felt was sadness. The photographs showed the same kitchen Sarah had redesigned, the backyard where Andrew and I once talked about Helen, and the oak tree I wished I could forget. Within days, buyers began scheduling viewings. Andrew called after the first open house. "Dad, strangers are walking through our home." I understood the pain in his voice, but I couldn't rescue him from it anymore. "Then use these last weeks to remember what having that home required," I said. "Not just money, trust." He went quiet. Sarah reacted differently. Through Daniel, she argued that selling would humiliate them socially and destroy everything they had built. I found that sentence painfully revealing. Even now, she seemed more frightened of losing the appearance of success than of understanding how we had reached this point. 2 weeks later, we received an offer close to the asking price. Andrew asked me to reject it. I refused. The numbers were fair, the buyers were qualified, and delaying would only turn consequences into another negotiation. When the sale became inevitable, the marriage between Andrew and Sarah began collapsing under pressures they had hidden for years. Andrew later told me their arguments stopped being about the house and became about everything else: debt, appearances, Margaret's influence, Sarah's resentment toward me, and his own habit of remaining silent whenever conflict became uncomfortable. Sarah moved out before closing. She left Andrew with a short message saying she could no longer live inside a disaster she believed his family had created. I found no satisfaction in hearing that. Their marriage wasn't mine to destroy, and I refused to pretend selling the house had magically made me victorious. At closing, I sat across from Andrew for the first time since the party. He looked exhausted. No Sarah, no Margaret, no confident smile. Just my son staring at the table where another set of papers would end the chapter begun by our signatures 3 years earlier. When the final document reached him, his hand stopped. "Mom would have hated this," he whispered. The words hurt, but I answered honestly. "Your mother would have hated what happened long before we got here." Andrew closed his eyes, then signed. I signed after him. The mortgage was paid, the remaining proceeds were divided according to our legal interests, and the keys passed to another family. Just like that, the house I once believed would become part of Helen's legacy belonged to strangers. My share of the proceeds returned much of what I had sacrificed from retirement, but depositing that money didn't feel like winning. What mattered was that I no longer had to buy my place in anyone's life. I began changing small things first. I joined a Saturday walking group. I started having breakfast with 2 retired coworkers every Wednesday. I repaired the fishing boat Helen had always complained was taking up too much space in the garage, and took it onto the lake for the first time in years. Slowly, my calendar began filling with things that weren't dependent on whether Andrew remembered to call. I even hung the wooden "The Johnson family" sign in my own garage. Not as a reminder of what Sarah had rejected, but as a reminder that I was still a Johnson even when nobody invited me into the photograph. Andrew and I spoke only occasionally during those months. He never asked me for money. He stopped blaming Sarah, Margaret, or me. His messages became simpler. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm trying to understand what I did." I never ignored him, but I didn't rush to forgive him either. Losing the house was a consequence. Rebuilding trust would require something much harder than signing papers. Then, nearly 6 months after the sale, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, someone knocked on my front door. When I opened it, Andrew was standing alone on the porch. He looked thinner, older, and more nervous than I had ever seen him. "Dad," he said, "there's one question I need you to answer." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "What question?" Andrew looked down for several seconds before finally meeting my eyes. "Why didn't you scream when she put you behind that tree?" "Why didn't you scream when she put you behind that tree?" Andrew asked. I looked at my son standing on the porch and realized he had probably carried that question for 6 months. "What do you mean?" I asked. His voice trembled. "You could have stopped her. You could have told everyone the house was partly yours. You could have embarrassed Sarah right there. But you just stood behind that tree. Why?" I studied his face for a long moment. "Because I was waiting for you to scream for me." Andrew went completely still. "I wasn't waiting for Sarah to respect me," I continued. "I wasn't waiting for Margaret. I was waiting for my son to look at what was happening and say, 'That's my father. He belongs beside me.'" Andrew lowered his head. "Dad, all you had to do was say one sentence. I would have remembered it for the rest of my life." His eyes filled with tears. "I saw you," he whispered. "I know. I saw you behind that tree, and I knew it was wrong. I know that too." His face tightened. "Then why didn't you say something to me?" I shook my head. "Because a father shouldn't have to teach his grown son how to defend him while he's being humiliated." Andrew covered his face with both hands. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he began crying, not quietly or carefully, but like someone who had finally stopped protecting himself from the truth. "I was afraid of Sarah," he said. Every argument became a war. I kept telling myself staying silent was keeping my marriage together. I nodded. "And what did the silence cost you?" He looked at me. "Everything." "No," I said. "The house was something. The marriage was something. But neither was everything. You're still here. What matters now is what you become after losing them." Andrew wiped his face. "Can you ever forgive me?" I thought about the question carefully. 6 months earlier, I might have wanted him to suffer long enough to understand my pain. I didn't anymore. "I can forgive you," I said. "But forgiveness isn't the same as pretending it never happened." He nodded. "I understand. Trust comes back slowly, through choices, through showing up when it's uncomfortable." "Then I'll show up." I opened the front door, Andrew hesitated before stepping inside. His eyes immediately found the wooden sign hanging on the garage wall through the open interior door. The Johnson family. He stared at it, then looked at me. You kept it? Of course. His voice cracked. After everything? I placed a hand on his shoulder. Sarah didn't get to decide whether you and I were family. Neither did that house. Andrew nodded, tears returning to his eyes. We didn't fix 20 years of love and 6 months of damage that afternoon. There was no dramatic promise that everything would return to normal, because I no longer wanted normal. Normal had taught Andrew to stay silent, and taught me to accept being invisible. We needed something better. So we started with coffee, then dinner the following week, then a fishing trip a month later. Slowly, my son learned that love didn't mean avoiding consequences, and I learned that boundaries didn't require bitterness. I never regretted selling the house. Losing it forced Andrew to confront what my protection had allowed him to avoid, and it forced me to understand something Helen probably knew all along. Being a good father doesn't mean giving until there's nothing left of you. Sometimes love means stepping back and allowing the people you raise to discover what their choices cost. And if there's one thing I hope you remember from my story, it's this. Never keep shrinking yourself just to remain inside someone else's picture. The people who truly consider you family won't hide you behind a tree. They'll move closer and make room.